Okay, this is the final part of Chapter 4, so this is Video 3, and we are moving from macrosociology to microsociology. So, as we move from the macrosociological focus on social structure, we are now going to be switching to a microsociological focus, primarily on social interaction, as well as what elements of social interaction do symbolic interactionists study. So, just a couple of terms before we get started. First of all, what is meant by social interaction? That's the process by which people act and react in relation to others. It does not need to be face to face, and of course, in a world where, people chat online, they sometimes have whole relationships with people they've never met in person, they have very close relationships to people that they play video games with, even though these are not people that, they've ever met. That probably makes a lot of sense to you. But social interaction could also be just impersonal. So the interaction that you had with, the person that you waved across the street in the pedestrian walk, or the interaction you had with the cashier the last time you went somewhere and got, rung up, checked out, those are also considered to be social interactions. And just in general, kind of two things to keep in mind as we're talking about analyzing the social interactions. The first one is just the social construction of reality, that we use our background assumptions and life experiences to define what is real. So this goes hand in hand with the Thomas theorem, which we've discussed before in this class, that if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. So if you think that a person gave you the stink eye as you were crossing the street, it doesn't really matter if they did or did not. What really matters and what is of interest is the fact that you believe that to be so, and how you then respond based on that belief. So much of our interactions with people, because we are not omniscient, all-knowing, beings, is really the Thomas theorem at work, that we interact and react to people based on our understanding of the situation, the reality that we have constructed, what is real to us in that moment. And so keeping that in mind, when we think about what symbolic interactionists study, your book talks about 5 different elements. I'm going to talk about 4 right now. We're going to save stereotypes for a later chapter discussion. First of all, personal space. This is culturally specific. Americans have a very high expectation of personal space, and symbolic interactionists study how people establish, guard, maintain their personal space, their personal bubble. Eye contact. We use this to be intimate, to show that we're really listening to someone, but just think about how uncomfortable it might feel to you if someone was to look at you without blinking. Or does the long gaze of a lover feel differently than the long gaze of a stranger? So like everything else, there is no objective reality here. It is that social construction. Some person's loving glance might be some other person's like weird stare. And once again, symbolic interactionists are interested in how people interpret this. Smiling, just like eye contact, it can be misinterpreted, and just like personal space, it's cultural specific. And then body language. Now, unlike gestures, which have a concrete meaning, body language does not necessarily always have a concrete meaning with it. So if someone kind of, shrugs away from you, you maybe can interpret that, they don't like to be touched, but it's not as much of an objective meaning as necessarily giving someone the middle finger, where there is a very culturally established meaning associated to that. Like maybe when someone shirks away from you, it's not that they don't like being touched, but they don't like being touched by you. Maybe it's because they have a infectious skin disorder and just don't want you to get it, but at the same time don't want to admit it out loud. The fact that we can come up with several different interpretations of what's going on when they kind of shirk away and don't want to be touched by you, versus the fact that there's really only one cultural definition to giving someone the middle finger, just shows that body language is not the same thing as gestures. Gestures are a specific type of non-material culture. Body language is an element of social interaction. And so when you think about who studies interactions, there are two sociological theorist names that loom large because they have created theories that symbolic interaction is still used to this day. And that is Harold Garfihnkel, associated with ethnomethodology, and Irving Goffman, who's associated with dramaturgy. So for the rest of this particular presentation, we will be talking about Garfihnkel and ethnomethodology, and then in even more detail, we'll be talking about Goffman and dramaturgy. So ethnomethodology is basically the study of the way people make sense of their everyday surroundings, like how we come to what we assume to be a shared story assumption of what's happening. And dramaturgical analysis focuses more on how we present ourselves, with a particular interest in how we present ourselves in terms of front stage behavior, our performance of our social roles, versus backstage behavior, when we can let our performance drop because we have the expectation of not being viewed by our audience. So I'm going to talk about each of these in more detail separately, beginning with ethnomethodology. So ethnomethodologists are focused on observable methods that people use to construct recognizable social order. So how do we come to a shared understanding of what's going on? Like, what types of questions do we ask? Like, how, do we look around to be like, hey, are y'all seeing this? Are y'all in agreement with what's happening? Ethnomethodologists emphasize that social reality has a precarious foundation. We believe that we all share the same meaning, but sometimes all we share is the belief that we share the same meaning, which is just a fancy way of saying because we're all constructing our own realities, we might be out here assuming that other people are constructing the same interpretation that we are, but they really aren't. And they're thinking the same thing about us. And so ethnomethodologists are interested in how people produce meaning in social settings, with the understanding that this is subjective, and therefore people don't necessarily really know if people share their interpretation or not. And so the example here is, in our society, we expect people to wear pants. So if you were to see someone that didn't have on pants, like, how would you respond? Look at that one guy in the photo, how he's kind of looking over with a confused expression in his face. Ethnomethodologists would be interested in seeing, what does he do next? Does he try to lock eyes with other passengers wearing pants? Like, hey, do you see this guy? Does he even maybe say something to other passengers? Or maybe he directly asks the guy, hey buddy, did you forget your pants? Ethnomethodologists would be interested in, when confronted with something unexpected, how do you define the situation? And as humans, the fact that we often want to rope other people in how we define situations is of a special interest to ethnomethodologists. And in case you're wondering, the reason why that guy is not wearing pants is because it's the annual No Pants subway ride that has been gaining in popularity. The years that when it first started, you perhaps were like the guy in the photo, super confused as to why this person doesn't have on pants. But after several years of being in existence, and as this type of behavior gains in popularity, it might start to be like people wearing green on St. Patrick's Day. So you are no longer as surprised, and you can kind of define the situation without looking to others to weigh in and help you clarify. Much more commonly used, or certainly much more commonly taught than ethnomethodology, is dramaturgy. And so dramaturgical theory begins with this idea that we are all social actors within the social world. So Goffman basically builds on the idea that we have statuses and social roles, and he calls this role performances, right? So when we are going about our daily lives with our multiple statuses and trying our best to live up to the roles expected of us as friend, mother, son, student, teacher, pet owner, Starbucks barista, right? Goffman was interested in how we enact these role performances. And so he uses an extended theater metaphor where he describes us as being actors and the people that we're interacting with as being audiences, and we're utilizing props in the front region or front stage, which is where the performance slash interaction is taking place. And then we can drop our performance in the backstage or the back region. And so in this way, although we are not really like the actors of Orange is the New Black, we are in fact kind of like actors in Goffman's theory, in the sense that we perform roles, use props, and we are delivering lines to fellow actors who are, as they are interacting with us, also doing role performances of themselves. So our audience is our audience, but we are also their audience, because in the interaction we are both being actors. And so in this way, dramaturgy is just basically impression management. Most of us want a successful role performance. We want a successful performance in the sense that we want people to agree that we are doing a good job performing our role. And so we make decisions in the front stage or the front region in order to ensure that this is the kind of audience perception of us. And so this front region is the place where the performance is given. So if you go back to that list you created in video 1, right, of your statuses and social roles, think about what you would need in order to do a successful role performance for one of them. So especially in my face-to-face classes, I try to come to class early. I dress in such a way that I am distinguishable from a student. I come with props, like I've made lecture slides, I have a pointer, I have a stack of folders with student work in them, right? All of this is to ensure that I have a successful performance as sociology lecturer in front of my class, who is my audience. But then at the same time, they are expected to be doing a role performance of their own in the role of student. And admittedly, some of them do a better job with this performance than others. Some of them have props like laptops and notebooks, and they take notes as I talk. Some of them, make it clear that they are paying attention by nodding and not looking bored and not being on their phones. Students who do not do those things, right, that are asleep or on their phone or not paying attention, me, their audience, I do note their role performance, and I at least internally acknowledge that they are not executing a very successful performance as a student in that interaction. Now, in the back region is where we can drop our performances. So when I am out of class, but particularly when I am no longer even in my office or on Gaston College's campus, I drop the role of lecturer, right? At that point, I am now just a gym member at Orange Theory, or I am a shopper at Whole Foods, or I am a runner at the local track. My students, when they are no longer in my class, some of them very quickly drop the role of student and they revert back to being someone's friend or someone's parent or an employee, right? And in the back region, the idea here is you can relax your performance. You can step out of character. You can drop that status and social role or tuck it in your back pocket, and you can take a break from it. And so the idea is that this is a place where you can reliably expect that no member of your audience will intrude. So I feel comfortable dropping the lecturer role when I am out of Gaston College, largely because I am in places where I don't expect to see any of my students. I perhaps would feel very uncomfortable if I ever saw my students somewhere where I didn't expect them to be, and I was behaving or dressed in such a way that now makes my role of lecturer it calls it into question. Kind of the best example of front region, back region, and dropping your role is if you've ever worked at as a server at a restaurant, because the kitchen is an area that customers are never expected to be. So while you might be all smiles and helpfulness in front of your table. I mean, I worked at Chili's, so it was all like big smiles and so happy you're here. And is there anything else I can get you? How about you try some of these nachos, or do you want a margarita to go with that? Sure, I can bring you a dessert, right? But once I was in the back region, the kitchen, if I had any complaints, I was free to make them. If I, didn't feel like smiling, the smile would be dropped. If I was frustrated, I would heave a sigh, because in this area, I could drop the role of waitress, friendly waitress, waitress who wants a tip, and just exist without worry that I will face any consequences for not continuing to practice my role performance. But sometimes our performances go wrong. So sometimes it goes wrong because, we just aren't doing a very good job with our role performance. So our presentation of self is not successful. So to go back to my example about my face-to-face students. So I'm looking at 28 faces, and 15 might be doing a very admirable job of their student role performance, and 5 or 6 are maybe okay. They kind of keep shifting in and out of it, but they aren't going to a back region. I can literally see them in front of me shifting in and out of that student role performance, and maybe even a couple are just doing a pretty terrible job. They're clearly not paying attention, or they're asleep, or they are obviously on their phone. And then when you have a bad performance, then it becomes what happens next. So, you've lost face. That's what we call it when something has happened that has kind of ruined your performance. How do you save face? And in some cases, how you save face is just by committing further to your performance. Or sometimes it's acknowledging that you are enacting a poor performance, but promising to do better and then doing so. Sometimes, if it's bad enough, it may not be possible to save face. If you have done something that is kind of so difficult for your audience to see past, then you might have to accept that for that particular role performance, you've just lost your audience, and they may never see you as being successfully exhibiting that social role. So there are a lot of extensive studies on, the dramaturgical perspective. There are a lot of additional terms that exist under this theory, but the ones that I most want you to know are the ones that I kind of have presented in this slides and in this presentation. And that is it for Chapter 4.